In functional programming, we generally like to treat functions just like any other variable, really. So we don't look at functions as functions. For example, take object-oriented programming, where all functions are methods. Right? We've got strings, we've got arrays, and all of that. And then we've got methods, which are just parts of the object. They aren't really the same type of or they aren't really variables like strings or numbers. But in functional programming, they definitely are. But if we treat them as in the same way as we treat all other variables, we should be able to pass in functions as arguments to other functions, and they should also be able to return functions, right? They should be able to return functions just like they could return a string or a number. And we're going to look at these things today. So over here in the HTML, I'm just going to add a button with the class of button, or btn. And I'm going to say click me. And this is a very basic thing in Typescript or JavaScript. All we're going to do is we're going to have a reference to this button, and then we're going to add an event listener. And as you can see, this add event listener is just a function, or rather a method maybe, but it is a function. And to this function we pass in a string and also another function. And I think most of you are familiar with this. All this is going to do is have a button over here, and once I click it, it's going to log hi to the console. So this is an example of a function that we pass into another function, and this can be very useful. So let's have a look at functions that return other functions. In my opinion, the even more interesting part. So I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call it add. And this function, I'm going to set equal to an arrow function actually, and it's going to take in two numbers, a and b. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just return a plus b. That makes sense, doesn't it? And if we now console.log add of 1 and 2, we should get 3. As you can see, we get 3, which is perfect. I'm going to remove this button now, by the way. So we get 3. Now let's do something a bit different. Let's say we don't hard code 1 and 2, but we want to get, these are two variables that we get from somewhere in our program. But we get them from two completely separate parts of our program. Let's say this is from one file and this is from another file. So we can't just pass them into this function just like this. What we have to do is what we could do in functional programming is instead of taking an a and b directly, we're just going to take an a. And this function is going to return a function. I'm going to write an arrow function as well, like this. And the second function is going to take in b. And in here, we will be able to have a and b. We will be able to have access to both of these variables. And then over here we can return a plus b. So instead of saying add over here with 1 and 2, I'm going to say add 1 and 2. We're invoking this first function with 1. This is going to return this function, so this in itself is a function, and we can have 2. So over here, as you can see, the application isn't that much different, but let's say we've got these two variables over here, and let's say they're coming from completely different parts. And what we now can do is we can just say is const func1, for example, obviously the naming could be better, is equal to add with 1, and then in a completely different part of the program with this completely different variable. Let's go downstairs over here with a couple of commas just to separate them. What we could do is now can say func2 or func1 with var2. Over here we should just for convenience just say 1. So as you can see, these two variables come from completely different places, and they could be in completely different files, but we can still just have this one function, alright? And we can create this new function, and over here we get the sum. So if we console.log this, as you can see we get 3. I hope this makes sense, that we can have variables from completely different parts of the program, but they can still interact with each other by having functions that return functions. So this is a very useful thing. Let's look at another use case. I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call this function multiply with random number. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. We take in a number and we'll multiply that with any random number. Let's say with any random number between 1 and 0. So let's try it out. I'm going to say console.log multiply with random number, and I'm going to pass in, let's say, 5. So this should be some random number between 1 and 5, and it indeed is. So this is great, but there's one problem. This is not a pure function, because if it were a pure function, every single time when we pass in the same argument, 5, it will have to return the same result. So let's try it out. I'm going to have this a couple of times, and as you can see, we get 6 completely different results. So it clearly isn't a pure function because it should give us 6 times the same result. So what I can do instead is I'm going to create a function called multiply. And over here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a, which is a number, and I'm going to return a function. And I'm also going to take in b, which is also a number. And then I'm going to return a times b. This is absolutely a pure function, and it's a function that returns a function. So we get the same benefits I've described before. We can have these two variables from completely two different parts of the program. And then, now what we can do is we can have const multiply with random number. I'm just going to copy that name. And I'm going to set it equal to multiply with math.random, like this. And now we can pass in 5, and this time it's going to be the same random number every single time. So if we try it out, it will give us 6 times the exact same number. So it's now a pure function, but we're still pretty much doing the same thing. We're multiplying with a random number. Alright? So there's a huge power behind having functions being able to return functions. And you'll realize how great this actually is once you will start doing more complex projects, because you will be able to write very short code with functions, and it's going to be beautiful, and you're going to be using functions that return functions.